All right, hello. Welcome everyone to the Kickstarter Global Game Jam Workshop of 2021. Super excited to be here. We're going to talk through a couple stats around Kickstarter, and we're going to talk about some tips and tricks on how to be successful on our platform. So hi, who am I? My name is Anya. I've been in the games industry over 12 years. This will be my 13th year working in the games industry. I'm the former developer relations person at Addicting Games and Nickelodeon, where I was there for about 7.5 years. And now I'm the director of games at Kickstarter, which is really cool. I've been there 5-6 years. Time is meaningless now. It's pretty great. I get to work with creators every day, and I'm really excited about it. So, pretty sure you all know what Kickstarter is, but just in case, Kickstarter's mission is to bring creative projects to life. We do that by connecting people to the projects that they love, and we like to think that we do that better than anyone. People from nearly every country on Earth have backed a project. Our community actually represents nearly every country on all 7 continents, and yes, this does include Antarctica, which is pretty cool. So what are some of the numbers behind Kickstarter? So Kickstarter has the largest and most engaged funding community. 19.1 million people have backed a Kickstarter project, and of that 19.1 million, about 6.5 million people have backed more than one project. So that's allowed 68.8 million pledges to be made to all projects. I do want to quickly note that this represents all 15 categories on Kickstarter. This is not just games. Games is a part of this, and we'll definitely go into sort of game-specific numbers, but important to note that these numbers specifically represent all of Kickstarter. Same with this. Kickstarter backers have already pledged $5.5 billion to all of Kickstarter, representing all 15 categories. This has allowed funding for over 195,000 creative projects, which is really cool. I do want to note that what we'll see of that 5.5 billion, a significant number of that is actually contributed to games. And I do want to say that the success rate for Kickstarter as a whole is about 38.3%. You'll see why that stat is a little bit important. So let's look at the game's numbers. Again, these numbers represent the full lifespan of Kickstarter, which is about 12 years. $1.4 billion has been pledged just to games, and of that, $1.3 billion has actually been successfully raised. This has allowed 24,000 projects to be successfully funded, which is really, really cool. And there are about 4.2 million backers to the games category. So when we talked about the success rate previously of 38.3% for all of Kickstarters, the game's success rate is 42.3%. I do want to say that that success rate has actually increased year over year. So in 2019, that success rate was 42.8%, and in 2020, that was 57.4%. So definitely excited to see what 2021 is going to bring us. Now, while we don't like to look at our category as like video games versus tabletop games, it is sort of important to note that there are two different sort of like spaces for these two different categories to exist. They require something a little bit different sometimes, but it's just important to sort of look at them in two different perspectives. So video games specifically. $275 million pledged to video games in the lifespan of Kickstarter. Of that, 237 million has been successfully raised. That has allowed 3,400 projects to be successfully raised on Kickstarter. Last year in 2020, we had the highest number of successfully funded projects in video games since 2014. There were over 400 successful video games, which is really cool. And we have about 1.9 million backers in the video games category. Now, the success rate I know can be a little bit scary to some people, 22.5% success rate, but similarly to what we saw in the games category as a whole, 26.5%, it was a 26.5% success rate in 2019, which is actually up from 2018. And in 2020, it was a 30.3% success rate, which is really, really cool. I do also want to note in 2020, we saw the most money we've ever seen raised in video games since 2015. So it's really exciting to see that the video games category has definitely grown over the last couple of years. And of course, we have to talk about tabletop games, the sort of behemoth on Kickstarter. $1.7 billion pledged to just the tabletop games category. Of that 1.07, 1.02 billion has been raised successfully. That's allowed 16,200 projects to be successfully funded. Last year, similar to video games, we saw the most successful and raised projects in 2020. So that means that we had the highest number of successful projects and the highest number of projects that raised money in 2020. 2.3 million backers in the tabletop category. It makes sense thinking about video games. And the success rate in the lifespan of tabletop games is 61.1%. Similarly, as you'll see a trend here, 2019, that was 66.9% success rate, and last year it was at almost 70% at 69.9% in 2020. So we have a lot of information here. We've looked at what's important, or we've looked at what the numbers are. So what is it that you need in order to be successful on Kickstarter? The first thing that you need is gameplay. For video games, you need to have 30 seconds of gameplay. This is incredibly important. For tabletop games, you need to be able to explain what the game is. Same thing, 30 seconds of gameplay. This all needs to be within the first 30 seconds of your video. You need to be able to show what the game is. Your video should also be short. 2 to 3 minutes at length at the most. Really, really straightforward. 30 seconds of gameplay, 30 seconds of who you are, 30 seconds of why you're coming to Kickstarter, and then just kind of put a bow on it. So if that's 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, great. Anything past 3 minutes can be really long and just ultimately not necessary. You can wait to save those for updates. Community building. You need to build a community before you come to Kickstarter. This is the number one thing that I harp on. So you need to be able to come to Kickstarter with an existing community, because what we typically see with first-time creators, and we'll go into this a little bit more, I'll show you what happens. With first-time creators, what we roughly see is about 30% of pledges will come in through Kickstarter. That does include any sort of features, promotions, any sort of like help that Kickstarter can provide. That number hovers around 30 to 34%. That means you as a creator are responsible for bringing in about 65 to 70% of your pledges. So build a community early and build a community often. Your main project image. So your main project image, that first sort of main project image that people see, try to not have it cluttered with any badges, any sort of like unnecessary information. Try to make sure that it showcases what the project is, what the game is. And be honest, right? So like, this is what the game is. This is what I'm going to be making. I'm excited to continue on this. Be upfront. Just be transparent with your backers. And lastly, your project should be about 30 to 35 days in length. I get a lot of questions about this. There's definitely been times when people have run shorter projects, something like a 20-day project. Typically, there's like a specific reason behind it. And there's definitely been a couple cases of people that have launched like a 45 to 60-day project. Challenge here is that we've done a lot of research on this, and anything that's less than 30 days tends to be a little bit too little, and anything that's about over 35 days is a little bit too much. So you want to kind of stay within that sweet spot of about 30 to 35 days. So super helpful to know what we should do. So what are some of the things that we shouldn't do? One, not having a video. I see this a lot. It's kind of not an option. You need to have a video. Two, never posting an update. So Kickstarter is very interesting where each category is a little bit different. So for example, in music, you can post an update, once a week, totally fine. In games, you need to post an update every other day. People kind of want to see what's going on. And there's two things to note there. One, we typically recommend like have your first couple updates just kind of like drafted and ready to go. You can always sort of alter them, change things as need be depending on sort of like requests that come in through your community. And two, the updates don't need to be super long. They can be something as simple as like, congrats to us, we achieved 50% in one day or something like that. Some sort of accolade to be able to call out to the community so they're a part of something. Having a bad launch day. So I see a lot of people launch on like Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Those are not good days to launch projects. We see for whatever reason that Tuesdays and Wednesdays are the best days to launch projects. The reason that Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and I understand the reasoning here, which is, well, it's the weekend and everybody's at their computers. That's not really the case. Most people are sort of looking at places like Kickstarter like while they're at work. So you want to kind of make sure that you're getting in tune with the eyeballs. Launching with visible stretch goals. This is a big no-no. Stretch goals, first of all, are not required. I get that question a lot. Stretch goals are not required. Stretch goals are an option if it's something that you're able to provide as an enhancement to the game and it's something you want to do. But stretch goals are not a requirement on any Kickstarter project. The challenge with launching stretch goals when you have a live project before you've met your funding goal is stretch goals can end up taking over the project. So don't roll out any stretch goals on a project until you've met your funding goal. Once you've met that funding goal, go ahead and launch those stretch goals. That's totally fine. Press reliance. So relying on like press, influencers, YouTubers, avenues like that. If you can get press, if you can get a YouTuber, if you can get a streamer, if you can get those sort of like outside influencers to talk about your project, that's great. But just understand that they don't bring in a lot of pledges to Kickstarter projects. This is why we say that building that community is absolutely necessary. And lastly, ghosting. Not wanting to give bad information or like bad news, right? It's okay if you have a delay. Everybody experiences delays. It's not a problem. But make sure that you communicate with your backers rather than just sort of not providing any information. I did also want to quickly touch on 2 new features that we have on Kickstarter, which is really cool. Both of these were rolled out last year. One is like now available for everyone, but the first is a pre-launch page. So this is a page that you have access to once you have submitted your project to a review and your project has been approved. As you can see, it's just one static image, and then a little bit about the project creator, basically who the project creator is, and then just like a sentence kind of speaking about the project. The thing that's really powerful here is that follower count. Once you have 10 followers, the public is able to see how many followers you have, and obviously you're able to see that too. So let's say that you're like, we did all this community building and you're 2 days before you launch and you only have 15 followers. That's a good indication that something is going on, and you definitely kind of want to look into where your community is. We've also seen people get really creative with this. We've seen people change this image out every day as like a countdown. So like live in 24 days, live in 23 days, things like that. It's really, really cool. It's super powerful. Just make sure that you get your project approved before you get access to this. And the second thing I wanted to, and I'm so sorry this image is a little bit blurry, but we now officially have add-ons, which is really cool. So you are able to create add-ons for any reward tier that requires shipping. So if you're like, great, new second copy of the game and a plushie or something like that, that is now available to you as a creator. And now, super happy to talk about the number one question that I get is, how do I get featured on Kickstarter? So couple different things. One, you want to have a strong project image. Again, as we sort of discussed in the list of yeses, making sure that you have a strong project image that really showcases what your project is. Have a strong image. Gameplay GIFs, you want to have those scattered throughout the page. That way our team is able to kind of look at things, see what's going on, see if we can pull any of those. You also want to talk to us early and often. We are available for any creator that wants to talk to us. We are a team of 3, so we are small, so we are not always going to be super accessible, but we do our best to respond to everybody that we can. My contact information will be at the end, but if you just email games@kickstarter.com, that will reach the 3 of us on the games team. And then I just want to do a quick plug for the games newsletter, which goes out every other week. We have full access to what games go into that games newsletter. So talking to us early and often allows us to be able to kind of say like, cool, okay, we can get this game in this week. Talking to us early and often also allows us to talk to our editorial team who manage all of the features and promotions on Kickstarter. We hate when someone launches and they say, hey, are you able to provide anything for us? It's really hard on the day that you launch for us to get any sort of promotions because there is a calendar, and keep in mind there are 15 different categories that we're trying to make sure that we promote. Similarly, it just breaks my heart when people reach out during the last 2 days of a campaign and say, hey, is there anything that you can do? It is almost impossible for us to do anything when it's the last 2 days of a campaign. So talking to us early and often is ideal. Typically, like 2 to 3 weeks before you launch is enough. That's fantastic. Lastly, we see a lot of badges on projects, so like, funded in 2 hours and EU friendly and things like that. We definitely strongly recommend not having those badges. They distract from what the project is. If you want to have those badges on the actual project page, that's great. Like, have those accolades. That's fantastic. We fully support that. But we do not like seeing them on project images. So let's look at a couple projects just to kind of see like what is successful. First game I want to talk about is a game called We Should Talk. This is actually out of New York. It's a short form narrative game that will make you think carefully about the words that you choose. This is run by Carol Mertz and her team, and this is actually from the NYU Game Center through their summer program, which is really cool. So they had a $5,000 goal, and they launched in the summer of 2020, like right at the height of the pandemic, which was a little bit scary. So keeping in mind a $5,000 goal, they raised over $13,000, which is absolutely fantastic. They funded on June 11th, again, right during the pandemic, which is a little bit scary, but they did a fantastic job. They have over 700 backers. The game is out. They are working with Whitethorn Digital as their publisher, and they did a fantastic job. Now, this is a graph that you'll see a couple times here, and each graph is going to look pretty similar, but it's important to note a couple things. That green little part of the pie Those are the pledges that come in through Kickstarter. So I initially said about 30 to 34% of pledges come in through Kickstarter. That's pretty much in line here. So 54% of the pledges came in through external referrers. That's for the community that the team was able to build. That purple part of the pie is any sort of like custom ref tags. So that's any sort of like newsletters, ads, things that were sort of external custom referrals that came in through just different sources. Now, this line graph is really interesting. There's a lot of information that we can parse from this. First, they met their goal very, very quickly. And one of the trends that you'll see on every single line graph, and they all might look a little bit different here, but the first 2 days or so is where you see a high level of activity. That means that the last 2 days tends to sort of mirror the last 2 to 3 days. This is why we tell people not to cancel their campaign, even if that little goal mark was like halfway through. You kind of never know what's going to happen. And I've even seen, projects are at 37% halfway through, which is like kind of scary. And then the last 2 days, the amount of pledges that come in just skyrocket. So please don't cancel your pledge. It's okay. Second project I want to talk about specifically is Super Hot. And granted, this game funded a couple years ago, but this is actually started as a game jam, at a game jam, a 7-day game jam, I believe. If you're not familiar, Super Hot is a unique stylized FPS game where the time moves only when you move. This game was inspired by Time for Cat, which was a Flash game from like years and years and years ago. They did have a pretty high goal of about 100K. But it's also kind of important to note that like this is such a huge Kickstarter success because this team has gone on to be incredibly successful worldwide with new creative endeavors as a publisher. Super Hot VR is incredibly popular, right? Like they've just done an amazing job. So 100K goal, they've definitely surpassed that. Over $250,000 raised. They funded in June 14th of 2014, right before the sort of big heyday of video games on Kickstarter. Over 11,000 backers. This is done by the Super Hot team, which is really cool. And if we look at their line graph here, there's a lot of information. Again, keeping in mind that this was in 2014. What I did see is that Reddit was a massive driver to this project, which I thought was so interesting. And that kind of makes sense as to why that external referrers pie chart is so big, that sort of orangey-ish color. 15% coming in through Kickstarter. I think that's more indicative just kind of the time, like the year that they launched. But that's not uncommon to see a small amount of pledges coming in through Kickstarter itself. Obviously, no custom ref tags, mostly because that feature wasn't available at that year. But again, this line graph is very similar to what we saw with the first project. First 2 days, huge amount of pledges, kind of peters off into a little bit of a project plateau area, and then the last 2 days really just sort of increases. So the third project I want to look at is also a New York-based team. This is a project called Blinks. This is with Jonathan Bobrow and his team. They are based out of here in New York City. I believe Jonathan is based in Queens. This is actually the sixth project from Jonathan and his team. This is the third Blinks project, which is really cool. This is a continuation of the Blinks game that currently exists, where they curated the top 6 games from their community of game designers and decided to make a Kickstarter project to basically create 6 new games for an existing game, which is really cool. They had a goal of 100K, again, similar to Super Hot, and they far surpassed it. They funded during a global pandemic in May 29th of 2020 of last year, over 1,400 backers. This is the Move 38 team. That's their name. And this is so interesting, right? So you might be asking yourself, wow, that green part of the pie is really high. Well, if you remember at the beginning, I said that this is the 6th project from this team, and this is also the 3rd Blinks project. So what we see is that while a first-time creator may see 30 to 34% of their pledges coming in through Kickstarter, what's a really interesting stat is the more that you run Kickstarter projects, the more likely it is that you're going to fund, and you end up funding quicker. So you end up growing a community on Kickstarter in addition to your existing community that sort of external referrers, right? So that's why this 53% is so high. And again, that 21% of custom ref tags, right? Mailing lists, ads, things like that. Ads are such a huge driver these days. It's really kind of exciting to see. They did an incredible job. But what's fascinating here is they met their goal about a little over a quarter of the way through, maybe about a third. Even though the first 2 days they had a huge amount of traffic come in, right? And there's various different reasons as to why that is. Time of year, global pandemic, just there's 100 reasons as to why that is. But again, this line graph is very similar to everything else that we've seen, where the first 2 days and the last 2 days tend to mirror each other. There's a little bit of fluctuation here, but that is not uncommon at all. Next project I want to highlight is another game that funded last year called Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. This is actually the second project from Owlcat Games. They're based out of Moscow. They first launched in 2017 and they raised almost $1 million. So their goal for this time around for the second Pathfinder that they created was $300K. And they definitely succeeded with over $2 million, which is really cool. So they funded in March 11th of 2020, right as lockdown happened. I think like the week that lockdown happened, at least here in New York, was when they funded. They increased their backer count. I don't actually remember how many backers they had on the first project, but I do distinctly remember that they increased their backer count. And they did an incredible job this second time around. So similarly, here we go. Same sort of like line graph here. Met their goal very quickly, met that $1 million goal about the last quarter of the way in. And because this is their second project, these numbers here were 32% of the pledges coming in through Kickstarter. Doesn't surprise me at all. It is interesting to note that just Kickstarter alone would have actually funded their project, which is kind of cool and like, I don't know, just like a fun, interesting thing. But over $1 million pledged their external referrers, which is really cool. I also think it's fascinating that this team didn't do any advertising and they didn't use the custom ref tags, which I think is so fantastic that they really relied on their community to bring in pledges. It's really exciting to see. Next project is a super cute game called the Fuzzies. This is actually the 8th project from this team. They're also based out of New York. This is Alex and his team. This is the same team that made Monikers and Wavelength, which, again, are both fantastic games that funded on Kickstarter. The Fuzzies is a game about creating impossible gravity-defying towers out of fuzzy little balls, then knocking them over. And their goal was small, about 100K, which is not unreasonable. You can see this is kind of what it looks like. And they definitely surpassed that goal of over $98,000. They had over 2,800 backers, and they funded in August of 2020. I tried to kind of focus on projects that most of them funded last year. And I tried to really focus on projects that were based out of New York since, I think it's important to kind of focus on New York since that's where we are. Same sort of deal here, fascinating, right? And so again, if we look at this, that 55%, this is their 8th project, it would make sense that they would have a huge number pledged through Kickstarter. They definitely, again, ads and mailing lists and custom referrals and things like that were massive for this project, but really it's that community that they built on Kickstarter. And same sort of deal, met their goal quickly. First couple of days, huge amount of traffic, a little bit of a plateau, huge drive at the end. Again, you should see a common thread here. And the last project I want to focus on is another team out of New York. This is Ruby the Wayward Mira. It's a 2D action platformer game based in a lush pixel world where science and magic come together. Their goal was about 12K. We actually had them in our room at Pax East last year, which was really exciting. We love being able to showcase creators from New York in our room. Obviously, the future of Pax East is unclear. Hopefully it happens in September. If it does, then we'll have the room again, hopefully. I think obviously everything's going to be different when we are able to do events again. So I don't exactly know what that's going to look like, but we're going to do our best to make sure that we comply with any sort of like CDC guidelines or any sort of PAX guidelines to make sure that our room is safe and fun for everybody. So they funded right before PAX, which is really cool. So they had the opportunity to use PAX as sort of like a promotional opportunity to be like, yeah, we funded on Kickstarter, the game's coming out soon. So they funded in February last year, February 6th, 12K goal. They raised over $42,000 and had over 1,200 backers, which is really cool, from Team Ruby, which is adorable. And again, this is a rarity. I don't exactly know what happened here, but 68% of the pledges came in through Kickstarter. I am sort of fascinated by this, and I kind of like when everything that we say to creators gets thrown out the window, because sometimes Kickstarter is just a crapshoot. But kind of doesn't matter either way, just in the sense that if all their pledges came in through Kickstarter, they would have funded, and if all their pledges came in through their external refers, they still would have funded. But you can see, again, with a couple dips here, they funded, about an eighth of the way in, maybe a quarter of the way. I'm not so great at fractions or percentages, whatever. Um, and the first couple of days tends to mirror the last couple of days. What's interesting here is they had a bit of a spike, a little past half of the way through their funding period. That's actually not uncommon. Sometimes things get picked up through Twitter or Facebook or some other sort of like avenue of some kind, and that's great as long as the project funds. I think that's kind of all that matters. So I get this question a lot, which is, what if I fail? And I would just kind of keep in mind that failure on Kickstarter only exists from the standpoint of you launched a project and you learned nothing. If you have a project that didn't fund on Kickstarter, that is not a failed project. That is simply a project that did not fund. Those are two different distinctions. It's incredibly important to make that known. And the cool thing is, if you don't fund your first time around, you can always relaunch. There are multiple cases of projects who didn't fund their first time around, reassessed, maybe changed their funding goal, maybe realized they needed to grow more of a community, maybe had a bad launch day, multitude of reasons as to what's happening. So they reassessed what was going on and then relaunched and funded, which is really fantastic. So please do not be scared of not funding on Kickstarter maybe your first time around. So we're getting towards the end of this. So if there's anything I can leave you with, make sure you build a community, show your gameplay, keep your video short, and you do not need to fund on day one. And of course, talk to us. So hopefully I was able to highlight that there's a couple misconceptions that we hear about Kickstarter. The biggest being that you need to fund on day one. That is absolutely not true. If that was the case, we would tell people to fund on day one. First 2 days and last 2 days are really sort of the pivotal points of any Kickstarter project. So everything that happens in between is basically just keeping people excited and keeping people engaged with what you're doing. So if you have any additional questions or you just want to reach out, this is my email, anya@kickstarter.com, or you're welcome to email games@kickstarter.com. Either is totally fine. You will reach us at the games team. So please enjoy Global Game Jam, and I'm excited to hopefully hear from some of you.